afternoon, everyone. It's 1 o'clock right on the dot, so we're going to go ahead and kick off today's legislative webinar. For those of you I haven't met yet, my name is Patty Mulvihill, and I'm LOC's Executive Director. Thank you for joining us today. Apologize again for some of the technical glitches we had last week. Hopefully we don't experience those today. Also, just thank you for any of you who showed up at Salem earlier this week for our City Day at the Capitol event. I hope you found those meetings with legislators productive. For myself, several legislative leaders and the governor commented positively on how many of you showed up in mass and in force to talk about city policies and priorities. Before we start with our formal update, just a few quick housekeeping issues. As Alexandra mentioned, if you have not yet done so, please make sure your microphone is muted. Secondly, in respect of everybody's time, we will stop this webinar no later than 1 p.m. If we don't get through anything, which seems unlikely, you can always follow up with lobbyists directly. At this point, if they haven't already, I will ask all of LOC's lobbyists to drop your name and contact information in the chat, along with a real quick summary of your issue area portfolios, so members on the call know who to contact with follow-up questions. If it's at all possible, if you could update your screen name to include your city, that would be helpful. We do this primarily so that we know which cities are participating, and also so that we make sure that we call on city members who have questions before members of the general public. We want to make sure that we move through all of the information quickly, because mostly we keep our questions to the very end, so we want to give you an opportunity to ask those questions. For today's legislative webinar specifically, we're going to cover 3 things. We're going to hear a quick reminder first off about the due date for street and bridge conditions reports to ODOT and why it's important that you meet that deadline. Second, we're going to cover a series of bills looking to make adjustments to measures 5 and 50. For those not intimately familiar with that, measures 5 and 50 deal with how property taxes are levied and the limitations therein. And then we're going to round out today by doing our best to give you what we believe is the most current information as we understand it on the president's executive orders. We'll try and focus particularly on those that could be related to federal funding. We've been receiving quite a bit of questions about that over the last few days. As I mentioned again, we're going to hold all questions to the end. When we get to questions, you can either raise your Zoom hand or you can put your question in the chat feature. Staff and I will do our best to make sure that we call on people in the order that we see them, but there's a lot of you on this call today, so please don't take offense if we accidentally call somebody ahead of you. So I'm going to double check. I had a note from staff. Is Jim on? Jim McCauley on, our legislative director?
Patty, I am, yes.
Ah, awesome. Okay, great. I have like 100,000 people on here, so I can't see everybody, Jim. So we're going to start with Jim. If you want to talk to us about the survey report we need to let members know about, I'll let you lead us off today.
Okay, super. Thanks, everybody. Good to join you today from Baker, Elected Essentials Central. So the first item here for us to at least share is to make sure that those cities who have not got your infrastructure conditions and road conditions information into Department of Transportation, that is due on February 1st. There's about 17 cities. There is a bulletin article that describes each of the cities who have yet to submit those online forms. It's really important to get those in because effectively, if you have not, ODOT is in the position of not obligating you your proportional share of the state highway fund. I think that's a pretty critical amount of revenue coming from an awful lot of cities for their road and streets, as well as their bridges. So just make sure you get those forms in by the 1st of February. And if you cannot, reach out to your local ODOT staff and give them a timeline so that you can get those in a timely manner. So that's really the crux of the reminder for folks.
And thanks, Jim. Just real quick, cities can find out whether or not they have submitted their report by looking in today's bulletin. Is that correct?
That is correct, and it has actually all of the links in there for the online forms that ODOT has had in place on their websites, and those cities will also be getting or have already received a direct email from me earlier this week.
Awesome. Thanks, Jim. And there was an article, but just so everybody knows, we've put a link to that article in the chat. So if you want to quickly identify if your city has or has not submitted its form, and if you hadn't, you can find a link to the form in that. So just take a look at the chat. So please get that. We want to make sure all of you get every ounce of revenue you can. We're going to pivot now to our tax and finance lobbyist, Jenna Jones. She's going to give us an update on several bills that relate to measures 5 and 50. Again, those measures relate specifically to property tax levies. Jenna's got 4 bills. All of them are coming out of the House to go over with you today. Jenna, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Patty. Good afternoon, folks. Happy Friday. So yesterday in the House Revenue Committee, there were 4 bills talking about creating task forces for Measure 5 and 50 and the impacts that had on disadvantaged communities, local governments, on public education, and on small and large jurisdictions' ability to use other revenue sources. So this is important, one, because I put out an action alert on Wednesday asking for folks to either send me logos to put on a letter of support or write some testimony. I just uploaded the sample testimony that I sent out to city managers and mayors on Wednesday in the chat. You can still submit testimony until 3 p.m. tomorrow when the record closes. We're trying to get as many cities to talk about the impacts that Measure 5 and 50 have on their budgets, and really personalize it for the members of the committee. I testified along with a couple of cities yesterday in person, and these task forces, while they're not solving Measure 5 and 50 right this second, could be a pathway for us to socialize the conversation and get legislative buy-in on larger property tax reform. So this is really a foot in the door, and we're trying to capitalize on this moment of them hearing these bills yesterday to do some more informational hearings and really hope they find one pathway forward on some sort of property tax task force that's legislatively sponsored. So that's what I've got. If you have questions, you can email me, text me, call me. My information's in the chat, and that sample testimony is there if you still have time and energy to submit a letter of support before tomorrow. Thank you.
Jenna, before you go off, not on these bills, but related to property tax reforms, Measure 5 and 50 and overall revenue, can you quickly flag some of the stuff the league's been doing on revenue reform, since it's seemingly related to these 2 bills for the membership?
Yeah, so the LOC board has been doing a revenue reform project, which in the last year has done some focus groups around the state, a statewide survey, and then also came up with the municipal revenue toolkit, which is out in the bulletin this week. And there's also a webinar next Friday from 1 to 3 to deep dive into parts of the toolkit. If you were at City Day, you may have hung out with Mayor Stovall and I and heard a little bit of a sneak peek into the revenue reform toolkit or the revenue toolkit. So that is a ongoing effort of the LOC board, the LOC finance committee, and staff to really push for good statutory and constitutional changes to Measure 5 and 50 and really find meaningful changes to the property tax system in the next couple of years. So that will be ongoing. You'll hear more updates in different venues. And our president, Mayor Jessica Engelke, will be traveling around the state for her presidential round tables, and she will be covering a lot of what's in the first half of the revenue toolkit, which is around developing local revenue strategies and communicating with your community members on your situation and getting their buy-in. So we invite you to join those conversations as well.
Thanks, Jenna. I appreciate the extra information on our revenue work. If you have any questions related to those 4 bills related to Measures 5 and 50, Jenna's the person to speak to. Anything related to revenue or tax reform stability is also Jenna. So we're going to conclude today. I mean, we're still new with the state legislature, so not a whole lot of local bills, but we want to finish today trying our best to give you kind of a picture of what's happening with President Trump's recent executive orders. We've been fielding lots of calls, emails, texts, and concerns from members over the last few weeks, particularly related to some of the executive orders that potentially implicate federal funding for local projects or local grants that you may have on your books or had intended to receive. Jim, I know you're coming remotely from Baker City. Did you want to start with the update, or do you want me to?
If you would like to start with the update, that would be great. I can fill in some additional details.
Sure. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, I am a lawyer by trade, so we'll give you the bad news up front. We don't know a whole lot, and that's because things are changing on the ground every day. What we are going to do to kind of try and keep the daily updates to a limit is every Friday, we're going to update a page that will be located on the LOC website, and we'll give an update here during this legislative webinar on what we know as of this time related to executive orders, and particularly as it relates to federally funded projects. So for those who haven't been following along, the president has issued a series of executive orders and rescinded several executive orders issued under the previous administration. It is incumbent upon me to tell you it's perfectly normal when there is a transition in leadership for some previous executive orders to be rescinded and new executive orders to be issued. That is all fairly standard. I think what has shocked most of the members, as well as people who work closely with the federal government, is the potential for federal funding to be frozen at this particular juncture, or threatened to be frozen, particularly as it relates to federal infrastructure projects that you are working on locally. So what have we been doing? LLC staff has been working closely with the National League of Cities. They operate as our federal lobbying arm to make sure that we know exactly what's happening. Their lead legislative director has close relationships with the government affairs team at the White House, as well as several administrative agencies at the federal level. So we are getting up-to-date information as much as we can from the National League of Cities. We're going to provide the website. And the other thing that we're doing is that we are working with our federal delegation to make sure that they understand the way this could or could not impact you at the local level. What I would tell you is that while the OMB memo, which specifically kind of froze a bunch of things to begin with, has been rescinded, the executive order itself still stands. And so very many federal programs are still being reviewed to identify whether or not those funds should in fact be released. This is still very much an emerging issue related to this topic. We're going to rely primarily on the National League of Cities to give us some information. They have done some stuff already that could or could not be helpful to it. And they've got a website we're going to click on. We're going to provide their fact sheets in terms of what's happening. And those should be available to you hopefully by the end of today for everybody to know. The other thing that we've received a lot of questions and concerns about are the immigration executive orders. Several of us participated in a seminar today that was put together by an immigration attorney at the national level. On its face, some of the immigration orders related to the executive order don't necessarily change current practice. However, there are some interpretations of that executive order coming out from the Department of Justice in forms of memorandums that do seem to change the way we go forward. It's really honestly too soon to tell which will take precedent, the memo or the executive order. So what we're telling everybody is to just take a moment and give us an opportunity to really study what these do so we can give you some advice and see where things go. It's our expectation that there will be a substantial amount of litigation surrounding the bulk of the executive orders that have been issued. And until we get some direction from the courts, we may not have a lot to know at this point. Jim, you've got any more specifics you would want to fill in there?
Yeah, maybe a couple of points here. As you just stated, and I think it's really important, is to take a look at the story that we've written today. Make sure you're staying on top of the updates that we'll have coming in weekly. Make sure you fill out the portal and the form that NLC has created, but also let us know if you're getting word that your projects are being disrupted from some of these funding, either slowdown, freezes, or what have you. We're also making quite a bit of contact with our own state agencies who are also struggling to try to figure out what this looks like. And that means we've been talking with Department of Transportation because of any number of different transportation funding projects that have been coming through the system, but also with Department of Forestry and State Fire Marshal's office because FEMA reimbursements are pretty significant out there. There's an outstanding $80 to $100 million that are reimbursements, not for just this fire season, but in previous fire seasons that a couple of state agencies are very concerned about in terms of that funding coming through the process. So I think that's the best story we can offer at this point is keep abreast of what's going on, take a look at your projects, and make sure that you're reporting to the NLC portal that we've got a link to within the story, but also make sure you contact us and your congressional delegation members to let them know if you're having any challenges.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, that's our update for today. If you've got questions, you can raise your hand or put them in the chat. I'm not seeing necessarily any questions in the chat. There is Brandon Draw, City Manager. You've put a comment in there that you'd like to see these earlier so your council can vote on them. Brandon, what is your request to see earlier? We covered a couple things when I saw that chat come in. Okay, I'll let you clarify there. And staff's just informed me that there are 2 additional items that Jim wanted to update us on. Jim, you want to update those on those two additional items?
So let me start with the CIP. So we've got a webinar that we've got set up for next Friday from 9 until 10 o'clock in the morning. This is an opportunity to learn about some of the congressional funding opportunities that are going to be out there. We've got staff from both Wyden's office and Senator Merkley's office. This is your first opportunity for those of you who haven't participated in this process before to learn a little bit about these community initiated projects. That's the CIP. They're also known again effectively as congressionally targeted funding. So it's a webinar, like I said, 9 to 10, February 7th, and that's next Friday. It's a pretty loaded day, but these are some of the real important things that are coming up from us. And what was the second item? I'm not seeing that.
I'm not seeing it either. I think somebody mistyped. So I went back and looked at my notes. So I apologize. It does look like
was going to do an update on City Day, a follow-up on City Day. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. So I think the main thing on City Day at this point is take the opportunity to celebrate. We had a heck of a turnout, certainly record levels of members participating, as well as number of cities participating. I think the biggest thing at this point for us is make sure you follow up. Make sure you get those thank you notes out to the legislators that you got a chance to meet with. If you've got issues that you need to follow up with them, do so. And this is really your opportunity to start those relationships and maintain them. We'll have legislative alerts starting to come up here over the next few weeks, and make sure you take that opportunity to engage in this legislative process. You certainly heard us talk about this on City Day, the importance of your involvement and the opportunity to really get to know your legislators and be their eyes and ears on the ground. Your constituents are their constituents, and the better relationships that you're able to establish and provide that education of what your challenges are, the better off we're going to be for session.
Thanks, Jim. It does look like we've got a question. It says, are you following other introduced bills that affect local government? House Bill 2084 requires public agencies to periodically during the course of a contract check with the Department of Revenue and local taxing entities to verify no taxes are owed. If one of those entities reports that they are owed taxes, whether they are taxes for personal property, mass transit, local payroll, or whatever, then the contracting agency is supposed to terminate the contract. This looks like a huge burden on local agencies for no benefit. Nolan, you came on screen. I don't mean if that's your bill. Is that why I'm seeing you?
Yes. No, I appreciate you flagging this. So this came up in a public hearing.
Hey, Nolan, can you introduce yourself first? Sorry.
Yes, my apologies. Nolan Plesha, lobbyist with the league. Public contracting is now in my portfolio. So this bill, as well as another one, just to keep your eye on, Senate Bill 800. 2084 was up for a public hearing last week. Senate Bill 800 was up for a public hearing on a Monday. We testified coming from more of a neutral position, but I just want to acknowledge we actually have significant concerns. But given so early in session, we didn't want to rock the boat too much and want to make sure we're still part of those conversations. And we did submit a letter of testimony on behalf of a lot of jurisdictions, including many public ports, AOC, the special districts, and more. Ultimately, for House Bill 2084, the committee did recognize that there are a lot of legitimate concerns on the bill, and they have offered to create a work group to address a lot of the concerns that we raised, as well as the concerns raised in the chat. So we will be working with the committee as well as the Department of Revenue and any others to participate in that and to make sure that local governments are kept whole. And then just to flag quickly on Senate Bill 800, there is also some significant concern on that bill. Senator McClain, came out of the gate really pushing back against the need for that legislation. Again, we also took more of a neutral position so we can work with them, the Department of Revenue, as well as the committee members on that bill. It is also in a holding pattern, but we are continuing to keep an eye on these concepts and working with our public contracting coalition to ensure that we are addressing these concerns and nothing bad comes through.
Thanks, Nolan. So the next question I saw in the chat is from Hermiston Councilor Jackie Litton. The question is, can President Trump freeze federal money to states that are sanctuary states? It's not an easy enough question. Immigration law is somewhat complicated. What I can tell you is that generally speaking, there's a lot of conversations around this right now. What the conversations around the executive order and some of the memos coming out regarding immigration reform tend to be more about whether or not cities and local governments and states are complying with what are called detainer requests coming out of ICE, and whether or not they're going to withhold federal funds if you refuse to comply with detainer requests. There are some cases out there that are on point, but nothing directly related to, can the federal government just say, you've identified yourself as a sanctuary state, we're withholding money. It hasn't gone up to the Supreme Court yet. This has been litigated on some levels at different factions and different varieties over the last several years at local circuit courts, but we don't have a decision. So the short answer is, I don't know. We do know that there are some additional, aside the executive order, Congress is considering some congressional acts that would specifically limit federal funding for states who don't comply with immigration policies and orders. Those obviously haven't been set for a vote yet, but it does seem as if the administration is looking to withhold federal funds if their immigration priorities and policies are not met. We still don't know what that means for local governments, but we are watching that one closely for everybody. It's a little too soon to have an answer on that one for you. I'm scrolling through my chats to see if there's other stuff coming up. I'm not seeing any other questions, staff. Am I missing any questions that you're seeing? I'm not seeing anybody have any questions they want to raise their hands to ask. Okay, I'll give you a few minutes. I would like to make one caveat note. There has been some press, particularly related to the league's position on House Bill 3115. For those who, from a previous session, for those who aren't familiar with that, House Bill 3115 in a prior session essentially limits the way cities and counties can regulate public spaces in relation to people experiencing homelessness. It essentially requires us to put together objectively reasonable time, place, and manner ordinances regulating how those public spaces are occupied. There has been some press that has indicated that the league is supportive of a full repeal. That's not the position. We are seeking to make amendments to House Bill 3115 so that we can receive clarity for cities on what constitutes an objectively reasonable standard. Right now, there's still a very real threat of litigation for cities because we have no actual identified standards that are considered objectively reasonable. And we're working our best to put you on a firmer footing so you know what you can or cannot do in that sense. So if you are seeing news reports that we've asked for a repeal, that's not correct. We're working with our communications team to get those specifically fixed so that people know our exact position. If you have questions that are more specific on House Bill 3115 and what the league is seeking to do, Alexandra Ring is our housing and land use lobbyist. She is running point on that information. Her contact information is in the chat. You can see it there. It looks like there's a question in the chat about the webinar on February 6th from 9 to 10. Is that open to everyone? And is there a link available? Jenna, that's your webinar. Is that correct?
That's the
mine.
congressional one, the congressional spending one. I can get a link and throw it in the chat though.
Okay, Jenna will get that link thrown in there. Councilor Peter Hall, I see your hand up. Do you have a question?
Well, yes, I'm not counselor anymore. Terms up, but I am a director in the fire district, and we've had some issues with this city, and this has to do with right-of-ways and damage caused on a city's right-of-way that then causes private something happen on a private property. So, who's responsible for damages done by, say, some camp that's on a city right-of-way that causes damage to somebody else's property? So, you know, who's responsible? Is the city responsible for it? Or is it just the individual who's camping?
Mr. Hall, I can't answer that question. That would be giving legal advice. It's also off the subject for the
Okay.
purpose of the webinar, which is to provide
Okay,
information on pending legislation.
Okay, so there's no legislation involved in that then? No legislation about that?
Not that I'm aware of, and I would suggest you talk with either the city or the
Yes,
district attorney.
we're gonna do that. So I wanted to see if there's anything that was in the works in the legislature. Okay,
No.
thank you.
Okay, any other questions from the membership? Okay, if not, we're gonna finish early. I know this is shorter. As we get through session and more bills drop and more bills advance, you'll start to see heavier updates. So please keep this on your calendar. Every Friday at noon during session, we will have these webinars. Please also keep on your calendar May 1st and May 2nd. That's the LOC Spring Conference scheduled for the Mill Casino in North Bend. We are offering scholarships for people to attend. Scholarship applications are open right now if you're interested in that. And if you're new to lobbying or you've been lobbying for a while on behalf of your city and you want some additional tips and tricks, please remember to check out our Lobbying 101 toolkit on the LOC website. It will give you some ideas on how you can go about speaking and working with your legislators. I'm doing one final check and I'm not seeing any questions in the chat or hands raised. So we're going to call the January 31st legislative webinar to close. Thank you for everything you do for your cities and your communities. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend and we will see you next Friday.